The orbital station, called Thalaros Prime, hung in the dark of space like a city made of silver and glass, spinning slowly against a curtain of distant stars. And somewhere deep inside its endless corridors and training halls, a young human woman sat cross-legged on her bunk with a datapad balanced on her knee. Her name was Juno Marin, and she was 22 years old, 5 feet 6 inches tall, and absolutely unremarkable by the standards of the 40-something alien species that trained alongside her at the Galactic Union Military Academy. Or at least, that was what most of those species believed. "You are reading that upside down," said a soft voice from across the room. Juno looked up and grinned at her roommate, a tall and willowy creature whose skin glowed with a faint blue-green light like something pulled from the bottom of an ocean. Rivette Solan, a Feskai female, stood near the window with all 4 of her slender arms folded in a way that made her look both elegant and slightly annoyed. "I am not reading it upside down," Juno said, flipping the datapad around, and realizing that she had in fact been reading it upside down. "Okay, maybe a little." Riveth made a sound that was something between a laugh and a chime, and the glow across her skin shifted to a warm amber. The Feskai way of showing amusement, before she crossed the room and settled onto her own bunk with the careful grace of someone whose bones were hollow, and who had learned long ago that the universe was not built for fragile things. They had been roommates for 2 years now, and in that time they had become something more than friends. They had become the kind of companions who could sit in silence and feel no need to fill it. The kind who knew each other's nightmares by heart, and never spoke of them unless asked. It had not always been easy. When Juno first arrived at the Academy, humanity had only been part of the Galactic Union for 12 years, and most species still treated humans the way older children treat a toddler who has wandered into their classroom. With impatience, with amusement, and sometimes with cruelty. Juno had been shoved in hallways, locked in training simulations, and told more than once that her species had no business wearing a cadet uniform. Riveth had been the one to change that, not with grand gestures or dramatic speeches, but with small and steady kindness. She had saved Juno a seat in the mess hall when no one else would. She had helped her decode alien textbooks that had no human translation, and she had once stayed up the entire night, talking Juno through a panic attack after a particularly brutal training exercise left her shaking and sick. Juno never forgot that, and so when the cruelty of the Academy turned its attention toward Riveth instead, Juno became something that surprised everyone who thought they understood humans. She became a wall. The Feskai were not a warrior species. They were navigators, scientists, artists, beings of light and thought and delicate beauty, and the galaxy respected them for their minds, but never for their strength, because they had almost none. Their bones were hollow. Their forearms could manipulate instruments with breathtaking precision, but could not throw a punch. And in a place like the Academy, where combat skill was currency, the Feskai were considered glass. No one exploited this more eagerly than the Korvathi. The Korvathi Dominion had sent a full squad of cadets to the Academy, all of them massive and scaled, and radiating the kind of confidence that came from belonging to a species that had never known physical weakness. They stood 8 feet tall, their skin was natural armor, their tails could shatter bone, and they walked through the Academy like kings who had been asked to sit among peasants. Their leader was a cadet named Dran Voss, and he was the single most decorated combat student in the Academy's current generation. Fast for his size, brilliant in his brutality, and utterly convinced that strength was the only language the galaxy truly understood, he had taken a particular dislike to the Feskai. It happened on a Tuesday, or whatever the station's rotation called a Tuesday. During a joint training simulation, Riveth had been assigned to a navigation role, and she had performed it flawlessly, guiding her team through a simulated asteroid field with the kind of calm precision that made instructors nod in quiet approval. But when the simulation ended, Dron and two of his Korvathi companions had blocked the exit and spoken loudly enough for the entire room to hear. "Another glass creature playing at being a soldier," Dron had said, his deep voice rumbling like stone grinding against stone. "Tell me, little Theskai, if I flicked you with one claw, how many of your arms would I break?" "All four?" The other Korvathi had laughed, and Riveth's glow had dimmed to almost nothing. The Theskai sign of shame and fear, and she had lowered her head and tried to walk past them without a word. That was when Juno stepped forward. She was 1.5 feet shorter than Dron, and probably weighed less than one of his arms, but she stepped directly into his path and looked up at him with an expression that carried no anger and no fear, only a calm and level steadiness that made Dron pause for half a second before his contempt returned. "Move, human," he had said. "Leave her alone," Juno had replied, and her voice was quiet, but it filled the room in a way that loud voices sometimes cannot. Dron had looked down at her the way a mountain might look at a pebble, and then he had laughed and walked away, because she was nothing to him, just another soft species with a soft heart in a galaxy that rewarded neither. Juno had watched him go. Her face had stayed perfectly calm, but Riveth, who knew her better than anyone, noticed that Juno's hands were clenched so tightly at her sides that her knuckles had gone white. Later that night, Riveth had told her to let it go. "They are always like this," she had said, her glow dim and tired. "It is not worth fighting over. I am used to it." Juno had smiled and said nothing, but something behind her eyes had shifted, something quiet and heavy and permanent, and Riveth had felt a strange chill that she could not explain. 2 weeks later, the Academy announced the annual Crucible Tournament. It was the Academy's oldest tradition, a sanctioned arena combat event where cadets could challenge one another in controlled fights, governed by strict rules and monitored by real-time medical systems. It was meant to test skill and courage and discipline, and in theory it was safe. In practice, everyone knew the truth. The Crucible was where the strong reminded the weak of their place, and the Korvathi had turned it into an annual ritual of dominance. No one had ever died in the Crucible, but plenty of cadets had left it broken in ways that medical technology could not fully repair. When the tournament bracket was posted on the main hall's display screen, Juno stood in the crowd and read every name carefully until her eyes stopped on one entry that made her stomach drop. Riveth Solan, Round 1, versus Cadet Thar of the Korvathi Dominion. Thar was one of Dron's enforcers, not as skilled as his leader, but just as cruel, and twice as eager to prove himself. Juno stared at that screen for a very long time, and the cadets around her later said that something about the human stillness in that moment had made the air feel heavier, as if gravity itself had shifted around her. She did not say a word. She simply turned and walked away, and the crowd parted without knowing why. Juno tried to talk her out of it. She sat on the edge of Riveth's bunk the night the bracket was posted, and laid it out as plainly as she could. Thar was dangerous. The Crucible rules were only as strong as the referees who enforced them, and there was no shame in stepping back from a fight that had been designed to humiliate her. Riveth listened with her forearms wrapped around herself, and her glow cycling through pale shades of violet, the Theskai color of fear. And when Juno finished speaking, she was quiet for a long time before she answered. "If I withdraw," she said softly, "every Theskai who comes after me will be called a coward before they even walk through the door. I will not do that to them, and I will not do that to myself." Juno looked at her for a long moment, and then she nodded. Not because she agreed that it was safe, but because she understood what it meant to carry something bigger than yourself, and she would never take that from someone she loved. "Then we train," Juno said, and so they did. Every night for the next 2 weeks, after the regular training sessions ended and the halls grew quiet, Juno and Riveth reserved a private sim room and went to work. Juno could not teach Riveth to fight like a human, because the Theskai body was not built for impact. But she could teach her to move. They drilled evasion patterns for hours, working with Riveth's natural speed and flexibility, turning her fragility into a kind of fluid grace that made her nearly impossible to pin down. You do not have to beat him, Juno told her again and again. You just have to not let him catch you. Make him miss, make him tired, make him sloppy, and the referees will see that you belong here. Riveth practiced until her muscles ached and her glow flickered with exhaustion, and every night she got a little faster and a little braver. And Juno watched her with a fierce pride that she kept hidden behind a calm smile. The day of the tournament arrived like a storm. The arena was the largest structure on Thalaros Prime, a massive combat dome with adaptive terrain, variable gravity zones, and seating for over 10,000 spectators from across the Union. The air inside hummed with energy barriers and the quiet pulse of medical drones hovering near the ceiling, ready to intervene the moment a fight crossed the line. Commander Valeth, the Academy's overseer, stood at the center of the arena floor and opened the crucible with the same words she had spoken for 90 years. An ancient Orith, she was made of something that looked like living stone, her telepathic voice pressing calmly into every mind in the stadium as she reminded them of the rules, the honor, and the consequences of violation. The early matches were intense but clean. Cadets from a dozen species clashed and tested each other with skill and respect, and the crowd roared for all of them equally. Then Riveth's name was called. Juno sat in the third row of the stands and watched her friend walk onto the arena floor. Riveth's glow was steady, a calm white blue that Juno recognized as her brave face, the color she wore when she was terrified but terrified, refused to show it. And across the arena, Thar stepped out from the Korvathi entrance with a grin full of teeth and a body built like a siege engine. The match began, and for the first 3 minutes, Riveth was magnificent. She moved like water. Every time Thar lunged, she slipped sideways. Every time he swung, she bent beneath the blow with a grace that made the crowd gasp. She used the arena's terrain like a dancer uses a stage, leaping over low walls and pivoting around columns. And slowly, impossibly, the audience began to cheer for her. Thar's grin disappeared. He was missing. Again and again he was missing. And the sound of the crowd turning against him was doing something ugly to his pride. Juno could see it building in the tension of his shoulders, the way his strikes stopped being calculated and started being furious. "Stay away from him," Juno whispered from the stands, her hands gripping the railing. "Keep moving, Ree. Just keep moving." But Thar was not stupid, only cruel, and cruelty has its own kind of patience. He feinted left, and then reversed with terrifying speed, and his massive clawed hand closed around 2 of Riveth's arms before she could twist away. The sound that followed was something Juno would hear in her nightmares for years. A brittle, hollow crack, like dry branches snapping in winter. And then Riveth screamed. It was not a sound that the Theskai were built to make. It was raw and broken, and it tore through the arena like a blade. Thar did not stop. He lifted her by her shattered arms and threw her into the arena wall with a force that went far beyond anything the rules allowed. The impact was wet and heavy and wrong, and Riveth hit the ground and did not move. The medical AI shrieked an emergency alert, and red barriers began to form around the combat zone. But before they fully activated, Thar crossed the distance and landed one more blow, a vicious kick to her lower back, and the crack of her spine was audible in the sudden silence of 10,000 spectators. Then the barriers sealed, and the medics swarmed in, and Thar walked out of the arena, with his arms raised like a champion, while Riveth lay crumpled on the floor, with her glow flickering in weak and desperate pulses like a dying star. Juno did not scream, she did not cry or shout or leap to her feet. She went still. Every alien sitting near her would later describe the same thing. The human had simply stopped moving, as if something inside her had shut down and been replaced by something else entirely. Her eyes tracked Thar as he walked out of the arena, and her face held an expression that none of them had a word for. Though three different species independently used the same phrase when they described it afterward, like watching a weapon arm itself. A Drenni cadet sitting 2 seats away stood up and moved to a different row without understanding why. In the medical bay, Riveth was conscious, but barely. 2 of her forearms were shattered in multiple places. Her lower spine had a fracture that would take months to heal, and her glow had faded to almost nothing. The doctors said she would recover, but the word fully was notably absent from their promises. The Academy's response came within hours. Thar received a formal reprimand and a temporary suspension from training exercises. Not an expulsion, not a tribunal, not anything that would leave a permanent mark on his record. The Korvathi Dominion carried too much political weight in the Union for anything stronger, and everyone knew it. Juno visited Riveth that night. She sat beside the bed and held the one hand that was not wrapped in a regeneration cast, and she said nothing for a very long time while Riveth drifted in and out of a medicated haze. When Riveth finally opened her eyes and tried to smile and whispered, "I am okay," Juno smiled back, soft and warm and steady, and squeezed her hand gently. Then she stood up and walked out of the medical bay. She walked through the quiet corridors of the station with a calm and measured stride until she reached the Crucible registration terminal, the same screen where the tournament bracket glowed in blue light, and she placed her hand on the interface and opened a provision that had not been used in 6 years. The Open Challenge Bracket. Any cadet could challenge any other cadet, regardless of rank or species or weight class. It was a relic of an older, more brutal era, kept in the rules for tradition but almost never invoked because it carried no protections and no limits beyond the basic Crucible safety protocols. Juno did not enter Thar's name. She entered the name of Dran Voss, the leader, the strongest, the one who had created the culture that told Thar it was acceptable to break a girl made of glass and light and call it sport. The terminal accepted the challenge and broadcast it across every screen on the station. Within minutes, the Academy was awake, and within an hour, every species on Thalaros Prime knew what the human had done. Dran Voss saw the notification in his quarters and laughed so hard that the sound echoed down the hallway. And when his lieutenants gathered around him, he said the words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "The little human wants to die for her glass friend. I will grant her wish." He was still laughing when he went to sleep that night. He would not laugh again for a very long time. The news spread across Thalaros Prime the way fire spreads through dry grass, fast and hungry and impossible to contain. By morning, every corridor and mess hall and training room buzzed with the same conversation, and it always started the same way. "Did you hear what the human did?" A question asked not with admiration, but with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for watching someone walk calmly toward the edge of a cliff. The betting terminals updated within hours. Dran Voss was favored at 40-1, and even that felt generous toward Juno. The Korvati was the Academy's apex predator, undefeated in every Crucible match he had ever entered, a creature built by evolution to be a living weapon. And Juno Marin was a mid-ranked human cadet who weighed less than one of his legs. 3 separate instructors found Juno throughout the day and pulled her aside to privately urge her to withdraw. Commander Relith, a veteran Orath tactician, told her bluntly that she was throwing her life away. Sub-Commander Dahl, a scarred Fenthari who had fought in actual wars, told her that courage without a plan was just a slower form of suicide. And even a quiet Theskai linguistics professor, whose name Juno did not know, stopped her in a hallway and said with trembling light, "Please, Riveth would not want this." Juno thanked each of them politely and declined every time, and her calm never cracked, not even once. That evening, she went to the medical bay. Riveth was sitting up in bed, barely, and with visible pain, when Juno walked in, and the moment she saw her friend's face, she knew why she had come. Her glow shifted to a deep and desperate red, the Theskai color of anguish. "You cannot do this," Riveth said, and her voice broke on the second word. Juno pulled a chair close and sat down and said, "It is already done. He will kill you, you know that, do you not? He will break every bone in your body, and the referees will call it a crucible loss, and the Korvathi will toast his name over dinner, and you will be dead, and I will be here alone with 2 broken arms and a broken back, and the memory of the only person who ever stood up for me being carried out of an arena in a bag." Juno was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was low and even, and carried a weight that made the air in the room feel heavier. "They broke your arms, they broke your back, and the system gave him a reprimand," she said. She paused. "So the system does not get to handle this. I do." Riveth stared at her, and her glow cycled through a dozen colors that had no name in any language Juno knew. And then she closed her eyes, and a single tear traced a line of faint light down her cheek. Juno reached out and wiped it away with her thumb, and they sat together in silence until Riveth fell asleep. Far from the medical bay, in study, rooms and barracks across the station, something else was happening. The other cadets had begun to research humans. Not the surface-level briefings that the Academy provided during orientation. The polite summaries that described humanity as a young and socially adaptable species with moderate physical capabilities. No, the cadets were digging deeper now, pulling archived xenobiology files and evolutionary studies and behavioral analyses that most of them had never bothered to read before. And what they found made them uneasy. A group of Veloxi cadets, insectoid analysts with compound eyes and a species-wide obsession with data, gathered in their common room and projected their findings on a shared display, and the room grew quieter with every new entry. Humans were persistence predators. Their ancient ancestors on Earth had not hunted by being faster or stronger than their prey, but by simply never stopping. They would track an animal for hours, sometimes days, walking and jogging and walking again, while the creature they chased sprinted and rested and sprinted and rested, until its body broke down from exhaustion. And then the humans would arrive, barely tired, and finish what they had started. Humans had an adrenal system that could override pain. When triggered by fear or rage or the threat of losing someone they cared about, their bodies flooded with chemicals that suppressed agony and amplified strength and endurance to levels that their normal biology should not have allowed. There were documented cases of humans lifting objects that should have crushed them, running on broken legs, fighting with wounds that would have killed a Theskai 3 times over. And then there was the bonding. Humans formed attachments, deep, fierce, irrational attachments to other beings, not just their own species, but any species they spent enough time with. And these bonds were not decorative. They were structural. They were load-bearing walls in the architecture of the human mind. And when those bonds were threatened, something ancient and terrible woke up inside them. A Veloxi cadet named Thrisk ran a private combat simulation, a predictive model that used Drawn's recorded fighting data against Juno's physical profile and training scores. And when the results came back, she stared at them for a long time before speaking. "She does not win on strength," Thrisk said to the silent room. She does not win on speed, or reach, or armor, or any metric that should matter in a fight against a Korvathi. Then what does the model say? Asked another Veloxi. Thrisk's compound eyes flickered, the insectoid equivalent of a shiver. It says it cannot find a scenario where she stops fighting. Across the station, Dron Voss trained casually. He spent an hour in the combat room, ran through his usual drills, and spent the rest of the day laughing with his Korvathi companions about how quickly the match would end. He gave interviews to cadets who asked about his strategy, and his answer was always the same. There is no strategy. You do not make a strategy for stepping on an insect. Juno trained alone. She reserved a private combat room and locked the door, and the only reason anyone knew what she did in there was because the station's maintenance logs recorded the power usage. She ran the combat dummies on maximum aggression for 6 hours straight. She ran laps around the room until her legs gave out, and then she got up and ran again. She practiced falling and rising, falling and rising, falling and rising, over and over, until the motion was as natural as breathing. Quiet Korvathi cadet named Soren Mach found her in the training room at 3 in the morning. Soren was not like Dron. He was smaller for a Korvathi, more thoughtful, and he had watched Thar break Rivet's arms with a sickness in his stomach that he had not been brave enough to voice. He stood in the doorway and watched Juno slam into a training dummy that outweighed her by 300 pounds, get thrown to the floor, and immediately stand back up. She did it again, and again, and again. Finally she noticed him and stopped, breathing hard, sweat dripping from her chin, and she looked at him without hostility, just patience. Dron will target your legs first, Soren said, quietly, and the words came out like a confession. He always does. He likes to watch his opponents crawl before he finishes them. Juno looked at him for a long time, and then she said simply, "Thank you." Soren left, and he walked quickly, and when a fellow Korvathi asked him later why he looked shaken, he could not explain it properly. He said that it was not anything the human had said, but something in her eyes, something that should not have been there. There was no fear, he said, and he said it the way someone might describe a missing wall in a building, not with admiration, but with the unsettling sense that something fundamental was absent, and that its absence changed everything. The morning of the match arrived. Juno sat alone in the locker room beneath the arena, and the silence around her was thick and heavy. She wrapped her hands slowly, winding the cloth strips between her fingers with a practiced rhythm. And when she was done, she pulled up a small holographic image from her datapad. A picture from their first year at the academy, Riveth standing on the observation deck with all 4 arms spread wide, and her skin blazing with golden light, and a smile so bright that it made the stars behind her look dim. Juno stared at that image for a very long time. Then she turned it off, stood up, and walked toward the arena door. Above her, 10,000 seats were filled, and the galaxy was watching. And somewhere in the medical bay, a girl made of glass and light was gripping the rail of her bed so hard that her one good hand ached. The door opened, and Juno stepped into the light. The arena was full in a way it had not been full in years. Every seat taken, every railing lined with bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with the collective tension of 10,000 beings who had come to watch something they could not look away from, even though most of them believed they already knew how it would end. Juno Marin walked onto the arena floor from the west gate, and she looked small, not just compared to the space around her, but compared to everything, compared to the lights and the noise, and the sheer weight of what she had chosen to do. She wore standard Academy combat gear, no armor beyond the thin impact suit that every cadet was issued, and her hands were wrapped in white cloth that was already stained faintly with sweat. From the east gate, Dran Voss emerged, and a wave of sound rolled through the Korvathi section of the stands. Deep, rhythmic chanting, the war song of the Dominion, and he drank it in like sunlight. He was 8 feet of scaled muscle and natural armor, his clawed hands flexing at his sides, his tail swaying behind him with the lazy confidence of a predator who had never once doubted his place. At the top of the food chain, Commander Valith stood between them, her stone body catching the arena lights, and her telepathic voice pressed into every mind in the stadium with ancient and immovable authority. The rules of the Crucible would be honored. The match would end on submission, incapacitation, or referee stoppage, and any violation would be met with the full weight of Academy law. Dran looked down at Juno the way a cliff looks down at the sea, with the absolute certainty that it cannot be moved. Juno looked up at him, and her face was calm, and her eyes were steady, and she said nothing at all. The signal sounded. Dran moved first, faster than something his size had any right to move, and his opening strike was a sweeping backhand that caught Juno across the torso before she could fully react. The impact lifted her off her feet and sent her skidding across the arena floor in a tumble of limbs and dust, and the crowd gasped, and someone in the upper stands whispered, "It is already over." But Juno rolled with the impact and pushed herself to her feet before the dust settled, and she put her guard back up, and she moved toward him again. Dran hit her a second time, a straight punch to the shoulder that spun her sideways and nearly dislocated her arm, and she stumbled, dropped to one knee, and then stood back up. He hit her again, a tail sweep that caught her across the ribs with a sound like a bat hitting a leather bag, and she went down hard, her back slamming into the arena floor, and she lay there for 1 second, 2 seconds, and the crowd held its breath. Then she stood back up. The first 5 minutes of the fight were a massacre by every technical definition. Dran hit her with strikes that would have shattered Theskai bones to powder. That would have cracked the chitin of a Veloxi, that would have dropped a Fenthari unconscious. Juno's left eye swelled shut, blood ran from a cut above her brow and from the corner of her mouth, and the medical drones overhead tracked at least 2 cracked ribs and a hairline fracture in her left forearm. An instructor in the stands reached for the emergency halt console, and Commander Valith placed one stone hand over his and said, without looking at him, "She is still standing. The match continues." Because Juno was still standing. Every single time Dran knocked her down, and he knocked her down again and again and again. Sometimes it took her 2 seconds, and sometimes it took her 5, and once it took her nearly 8, her arms shaking, and her breath coming in short, wet gasps. But she stood, and she put her guard up, and she looked at him with those steady, quiet eyes that had not changed once since the fight began. The Korvathi section of the stands had gone quieter than it should have been. Dran hit her with a combination that should have been a finishing sequence. 2 strikes to the body, followed by a devastating overhead blow that caught her on the shoulder and drove her to her knees, and he stepped back and waited for her to stay down, because everything in his experience told him that this was the moment when opponents broke. Juno pushed herself up, swayed, steadied, and raised her hands. Something shifted in Dran's eyes. Not fear, not yet, but the first faint shadow of confusion, like a predator watching prey behave in a way that violated every rule it had ever known. He hit her harder. She fell, and she got up. He hit her harder still. She fell, and she got up. The arena had gone almost silent now, and in that silence the sound of Juno's breathing was audible, ragged and wet and painful, and so was the sound of her feet on the floor each time she stood, steady and deliberate and absolutely relentless. In the stands, Thrisk the Veloxi analyst gripped the arm of her seat and whispered to no one in particular, "She is not trying to win, she is making him afraid." Because something was happening to Dran Voss that had never happened before. He was expending massive amounts of energy, trying to put down an opponent who would not stay down. And each time she rose, each time those calm eyes locked onto his again, the fight drained from him in a way that had nothing to do with his muscles, and everything to do with his mind. He was facing something his instincts did not have a category for. Not a stronger predator, not a faster one, but something that simply refused to end. And while Dran burned through his fury, Juno was doing something that no one except perhaps Soren Mach understood. She was learning. Through the pain and the blood and the cracked bones, she was watching. She was cataloging every pattern, every tell, every habit that Dran repeated without knowing it. The way he dropped his left shoulder before a tail strike, the way he stepped wide on his right leg before a lunge, the way his breathing changed half a second before he committed to a power blow. She began to adapt. Her dodges got tighter, not by much, but by inches, and inches were all she needed. Strikes that had been landing clean began to graze instead, and in the gaps between his attacks, she started hitting back. Small, precise strikes, aimed at the joints where his natural armor was thinnest. A sharp punch to the inside of his elbow, a kick to the soft tissue behind his knee, a short hook to the gap beneath his jaw. Each strike was nothing on its own. A human fist against Korvathi's scale was like a stone against a wall. But Juno did not need to break the wall. She needed to chip it, again and again and again, because that was what her species did. That was what persistence meant. The turning point came 12 minutes into the fight. Dran swung his tail in a massive horizontal arc that caught Juno full in the chest, and the crack of her ribs, not a hairline this time, but a full break, at least two. She was lifted off the ground and thrown backward, and she hit the floor on her back and lay there motionless. The arena fell completely silent. The referee began to move forward, and the medical drones descended, and 10,000 spectators watched the small broken human lying on the arena floor and believed with absolute certainty that it was over. Juno's fingers twitched. Then her hands pressed flat against the floor. Then slowly, so slowly that it hurt to watch, she pushed herself up, first to her knees, then to one foot, then to both feet, swaying like a tree in a hurricane, blood dripping from her chin, and her broken ribs screaming with every breath. And for the first time in the fight, she smiled. It was not a happy smile, and it was not a cruel smile. It was the smile of someone who had found the bottom of their pain and discovered that there was still something left beneath it, something that did not care about pain at all. Something was now fully awake. Dran took a step backward. He did not realize he had done it until it was already done, and by then it was too late, because everyone in the arena had seen it. The greatest combat cadet in the Academy's history had retreated from a bleeding, broken human girl who weighed less than his arm. The fight shifted like a tide turning. Dran was gasping now, his massive lungs working harder than they had ever worked in a crucible match, his strikes slowing by fractions that Juno's newly calibrated instincts could read like text on a page. She slipped under a hook that would have taken her head off a minute earlier, and she drove her fist into the soft gap behind his knee with everything she had. Dran stumbled. She hit the same knee again, and his leg buckled, and for the first time in the match, for the first time in any match he had ever fought, Dran Voss dropped to one knee. The sound that went through the crowd was not a cheer. It was a collective intake of breath, a sound of 10,000 beings witnessing something impossible. Juno did not stop. She could not stop, because stopping was not something her body knew how to do anymore. She hit him in the elbow joint, in the ribs where a hairline crack from her accumulated strikes had finally spread wide enough to matter, in the jaw where the scale was thin and the nerve clusters ran close to the surface. Dran roared and lunged forward in a desperate tackle, and Juno sidestepped, barely, her broken ribs howling, and as he stumbled past her, she leaped onto his back and locked her arms around his neck. It was a chokehold, a human technique, ancient and simple and brutally effective, and her small frame wrapped around his massive body like a vice. Dran thrashed and clawed at her arms, his talons ripping through her impact suit and drawing lines of bright red blood across her forearms. And the pain must have been extraordinary, but she did not let go. Her left arm dislocated from the strain, the shoulder popping out of its socket with a sound that made the nearest spectators flinch. And she tightened her grip with her right arm and squeezed harder. Dran's thrashing slowed. His clawing became weaker. His massive body sank to both knees, and the war chanting from the Korvathi section had died completely. And the only sound in the arena was the wet, ragged breathing of a human girl who had decided that she would break before she would let go. Dran's eyes rolled back, and his body went limp, and he collapsed forward with Juno still clinging to his neck, like something forged from iron and fury. The medical AI declared incapacitation, and the match was over. Juno released him and rolled off him, unconscious body, and lay on the arena floor for 3 long seconds. And then, impossibly, absurdly, beautifully, she stood up one last time. She was broken in more places than she was whole. One arm hung useless at her side. Blood soaked her suit from collar to waist. Her face was swollen and torn, and she swayed on her feet like a candle flame in a storm. She looked up at the Korvathi section of the stands. She did not say a word. She did not need to, because her silence said everything that needed to be said, and what it said was, "This is what happens when you touch what is mine." Then she turned and walked toward the arena exit, and she made it exactly 4 steps past the gate before her legs gave out and the medics caught her. And as consciousness drained away like water through her fingers, she whispered 5 words that the nearest medic would remember for the rest of their career. "Tell Ree, I got up." Juno Marin woke up 3 days later in a medical bay bed, wrapped in so many regeneration casts that she looked like something halfway between a mummy and a sculpture that had been dropped from a great height. The first thing she saw was light, a soft, warm, golden glow coming from the chair beside her bed. And when her one good eye focused, she found Riveth Solan sitting there with her 2 unbroken arms folded in her lap, and her glow pulsing in a color that Juno had never seen before, something between deep amber and pale rose, a shade that the Fesci had no name for because it described a feeling that most of them had never needed to express. Riveth had dragged herself from her own recovery bed, loaded her broken body into a hover chair, and crossed the entire medical ward to sit beside Juno, and by the look of her, hollow-eyed and trembling with the effort it had cost her, she had been sitting there for a very long time. "You absolute fool," Riveth whispered, and her voice cracked in 3 places. Juno tried to smile, and it hurt in ways she did not know smiling could hurt, but she did it anyway. "Did you watch?" "Every second. I watched every second, and I have never been more terrified or more furious or more—" Riveth stopped, and her glow flared bright, and then dimmed, and she pressed her good hand over her eyes. "You could have died. But I did not. That is not the point." "It is exactly the point," Juno said softly, and she reached out with her one functioning hand, the right one, the one that had held the chokehold until the world went dark, and she found Riveth's fingers and held them gently. "You would have done the same for me." Riveth looked at her through the light of her own tears and said very quietly, "No, I would not have survived it, and that is what makes you terrifying." Juno squeezed her hand and closed her eye and said nothing, because some truths are better left unheld, and because she was very tired, and because Riveth's hand in hers was the only medicine that mattered. The days that followed reshaped the Academy in ways that no one had predicted. The political fallout hit the Korvathi Dominion like a shockwave. A species that had built its entire identity on physical supremacy had just watched its finest cadet lose to a creature half his size in front of 10,000 witnesses. and the footage had already spread to every corner of the Union. The Corvathi Diplomatic Corps sent formal protests, and the Dominion's military council demanded the match be classified as an anomaly. But the footage was impossible to argue with, because it showed exactly what had happened. A Corvathi champion had beaten a human girl half to death, and she had simply refused to stop getting up until he was the one lying on the floor. Dran Voss recovered physically within a week. The Corvathi body healed fast, and his injuries were minor compared to what he had inflicted. But something inside him had broken in a way that regeneration casts could not reach. He stopped attending training sessions, stopped speaking to his fellow cadets, and spent long hours sitting alone in his quarters, staring at the wall, with an expression that those who saw it described as the face of someone who had lost, not a fight, but a certainty. The certainty that he was the strongest thing in any room he entered, and without that certainty, Dran Voss did not know who he was. He withdrew from the academy 2 weeks later, without ceremony and without explanation, and the Corvathi who remained did not speak his name. Thar's fate was different, but equally final. The renewed attention on the Crucible tournament had forced the academy to review Rivet's original match, and this time, with the entire Union watching, the review board could not afford to be lenient. Thar was expelled for excessive force resulting in grievous injury, stripped of his cadet rank, and sent back to the Dominion in a transport shuttle with a permanent mark on his military record that would follow him for the rest of his career. It was not justice. Rivet's arms were still broken, and her back still ached, and she would carry the memory of that arena floor for the rest of her life. But it was something, and sometimes something is the first step toward enough. Commander Valeth summoned Juno to her office on the 6th day after the match, when the doctors had cleared her for short walks, but not much else. Juno shuffled in, with one arm in a sling, and a limp that made every step a negotiation with pain. And she sat in the stone chair across from the ancient overseer, and waited. Valeth studied her for a long time. The Oreth did not have eyes in the traditional sense, but their perception was deep and thorough and missed nothing. And when she finally spoke, her telepathic voice was neither warm nor cold, but carried something that might have been wonder. "You could have died," she said. The medical team nearly stopped the match 6 times, and each time you were on your feet before they could activate the barriers. "I know," Juno said. "I have overseen this academy for 90 years, Cadet Marin. I have watched 10,000 matches, trained cadets from every species in the Union, and I have never seen anything like what you did in that arena." Juno said nothing, because she did not know what to say to that. "I am not going to discipline you," Valeth continued. "What I'm going to do is ask you a question, and I want you to answer it honestly. What are humans?" Juno thought about it. She thought about Earth, about the old stories of her species, about the runners who chased antelope across savannas until the animals collapsed, about the climbers who scaled mountains because the mountains were there, about the soldiers who threw themselves on grenades to save people they had known for only a few weeks, about every stupid and beautiful and impossible thing her species had ever done, because someone they cared about was in danger. "We are the species that does not know when to quit," she said, "especially when someone we love is the reason to keep going." Valeth was silent for a long time after that, and when Juno left the office, she thought she felt something brush against her mind. Not words exactly, but an impression, like a stone hand placed gently on her shoulder. And it felt like respect. The cultural shift at the academy was immediate and profound, but it did not look the way the humans in old stories might have imagined. There were no parades, no speeches, no monuments built to Juno's victory. Instead, there was something quieter and in many ways more powerful. A recalibration. Species that had dismissed humans as soft and sentimental began to review their assessments with fresh eyes. And what they saw unsettled them in a way that raw strength never had. Because strength, they understood, strength had limits and rules and could be measured and predicted. But what Juno had shown them was something else entirely. A will that bent but did not break. A body that kept moving past every boundary that biology should have enforced. And at the center of it all, a bond with another being so fierce that it turned a small, fragile creature into something that the strongest species in the galaxy could not put down. A Korvathi elder, a retired general who had watched the match from a diplomatic viewing suite, was quoted in a Union broadcast saying words that spread across 100 worlds. "We thought humans were soft because they form attachments. We were wrong. Their attachments are what make them dangerous." Thrisk the Veloxi, who had run the combat simulation that could not find a scenario where Juno stopped fighting, updated her species' official diplomatic file on humanity. Under the section labeled Threat Assessment, she deleted 3 paragraphs of technical analysis and replaced them with a single line. Do not harm what they love. On a smaller and more personal scale, a quiet Korvathi cadet named Soren Mach found Juno sitting on a bench in the Academy Gardens 3 weeks after the match. He stood at a respectful distance and waited until she noticed him. And when she looked up, he spoke carefully, as if each word was a bridge he was building over a chasm he was not sure he could cross. "What you did changed something in me," he said. "I watched Thar break your friend, and I said nothing, and I have been ashamed of that silence every day since. I do not want to be like Dran, and I do not want to be like Thar, and I did not know what else a Korvathi could be until I watched you stand up 18 times in a row against someone who should have destroyed you." Juno looked at him, this massive reptilian creature standing before her with his clawed hands clasped together and his head lowered. And she smiled, a real smile this time, one that reached her bruised eyes. She held out her hand. Soren looked at it, and then he reached out and took it, and his enormous scaled palm closed around her small human fingers with a gentleness that surprised them both. The first Korvathi human handshake in Academy history, witnessed by no one and recorded in no file, but real and warm and full of the kind of meaning that changes the shape of the future. Months passed. Riveth healed, slowly, painfully, and not without setbacks. But the Feskai body was resilient in its own way, and with time and care, her arms mended and her back strengthened, and though she would always move a little more carefully than she had before, her glow returned to its full brightness, and she laughed again, and that was enough. On a quiet evening near the end of the semester, Juno and Riveth sat together on the observation deck at the top of Phalaros Prime. The wide, curved window that looked out on the galaxy in all its impossible vastness, stars scattered across the dark like seeds thrown by a careless hand. Riveth's skin glowed a deep, contented gold, the warmest color her species could produce, the one that meant safety and belonging and home. And she leaned her head against Juno's shoulder, and her 4 arms were whole and folded peacefully in her lap. "The whole galaxy is afraid of you now, you know," she said softly. Juno chuckled, a quiet sound, small and human and warm, and rested her cheek against the top of Riveth's head. "Good," she said. "Then, nobody touches you again." They sat there for a long time, 2 small figures against the vast dark, and the stars burned on around them in their ancient and patient silence. And somewhere in the files and records and diplomatic briefings of 40 alien civilizations, a new entry was being written, not about a battle or a weapon or a war, but about a simple truth that the galaxy was only now beginning to understand. That humanity's greatest strength was never in their fists, or their endurance, or their refusal to stay down. It was in their terrible, beautiful, unbreakable ability to love something so fiercely that the whole universe had to move aside, and the galaxy took note, and the galaxy remembered, and the galaxy learned what every species eventually learns when they make the mistake of hurting what a human holds dear. They get back up every single time, and they do not stop until the ones they love are safe